Hi, and welcome to the 76th in our Middle Eastern history series on the last Shah of Iran. The rules, for those of you who are unfamiliar, this is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in history, religion, philosophy, politics, or any of the topics that we're going to be discussing today. That said, I'm going to try and give this presentation in a secular perspective, that is to say, not to weight any of the different sides. I also believe in the law of being respectful, right? This is going to be a sensitive topic, like all topics in Middle Eastern history. So let's approach it with the candor that it deserves. That said, I love interactivity, questions, comments, clarifications. Please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time. If you prefer to ask your questions auditorily, at the end of 2 hours, I will have a Q&A period, and you can put up your hand and I will call on you. What I'd like to say is that these presentations are a 101 and a 201. A 101 meaning that if you already know something, I'll probably tell you something you didn't know. Sorry, a 201, that's what the 201 means. And a 101 means that if you don't know anything, I'll probably tell you enough to get started. And there will be a 2-hour hard stop. So if I don't get through all my slides today, that's okay. We'll just put that into the next week's presentation, which is in any way the successor presentation to this one on the Islamic Republic of Iran. When I put dates below a person, typically if the person is a political figure, those are their years of service. If it's a recurrent political figure, it's the years of service that are relevant for the discussion that we're having at the moment. And if I put dates below for somebody else, be it a thought leader, an artist, something like that, those are the years of their life. This episode, like all the other episodes in this series, will be recorded, and you can find all of those recordings at our YouTube page. Please subscribe to our YouTube page to see all of the episodes that we've done, the 75 previous episodes in this series, all the other series of History Mostly Ancient discussions, and we would be delighted if you see things that you enjoy. We would also encourage you to join our meetup. While there are other meetup groups, this one will have all of the History Mostly Ancient discussions meetings, and you can see all of those in real time. And of course, we have premium Zoom, premium meetup, and premium YouTube, which all cost money. We're going to continue, of course, to provide these presentations without any requirement of payment. But if you enjoy what you see, if you're having a great time, we encourage you to donate so that way we can continue to provide. All right, so there are a couple things that I want to point out that we're going to see repeatedly throughout this presentation, and sort of should define how we understand Iran and the larger context in the region. The first thing is that when we're talking about Iran, we have to understand that there is no centralized power from a political perspective in the country. And there are different groups that represent different sort of agents in the country that bring us to the point where these different groups will have to form in coalitions with each other in order to achieve anything, because they could be stymied by a coalition of the others. Right? This is very different from a situation, for example, that we have in the United States or in the United Kingdom, where you have one party that can effectively rule almost always without coalescing with minority groups. And so these coalitions sort of break down into 4 different or 5 different buckets, depending on how you count it. You're going to have the landowners and the traditional well-landed elite. You're going to have the religious scholars, the ulama, and their students. You're going to have those who have created money through trade. Iran was on the center of a number of different trade routes. So those are the merchants and the Bazaar Guild. You're going to have those who are supported externally, be they communists on the, let's say, Soviet side, or capitalists and other sorts of similar agents, if we're talking about on the British or the American side. And so these different brokers are going to be fighting with each other in terms of the various different moments in history in Iran, especially during this period. Another sort of thing that we should keep in mind is the idea of regionalization versus the idea of centralization, meaning that In some cases, we're going to see different groups in different regions trying to pull apart and try and resist a national Iranian identity. And in other cases, we're going to see more and more power accumulating to the Shah, and in that way, being able to concretize his rule and solidify his rule at the expense of these different regions. We often see, in tandem with this centralization, a loss of individual human rights or individual human agency as more and more power is centralized in the core. And when you have regionalization, you have more rights, but also with it more violence and more internecine strife between different groups. So the next thing that I want to talk about is that Iran during this period has a massive population growth, and we'll get into the details on that. And that's not dissimilar from other places in the Middle East, but because of Iran's more stable organization of government, that population growth leads to a lot of emotional turbulence and instability, especially as you have rapid onset urbanization and the disintegration of lifestyles and communities. And we're going to talk about that as we go through this. We're also going to see that Iran has a massive economic differential throughout this period, depending on whether it's acquiring or not acquiring the wealth from the oil that's being derived from its territories, and to what extent those revenues are going to the larger population. And finally, we have the situation of imperialism, and we're going to see three different imperial powers throughout this. We're going to see the Russia/Soviet Union as one imperial power. We're going to see the British Empire as another imperial power. We're going to see the Americans as a third imperial power. Each of these countries at different points in time are going to be dominant in Iranian politics and try to exert their power over the Iranian state structure. And so a lot of our discussion today will talk about how they did or didn't affect Iranian politics, of course, in connection with the Iranians themselves and how those different power brokers responded to these foreign influences. So, to remind us, in the 19th century, Iran was a much larger country than it is today. And you can see all those colored regions outside of Iran. Those were all part of Iran with a very few exceptions prior to the beginning of the 19th century. And the reason that Iran lost all those territories in the north, be they the green ones that are today Eastern Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, be they the tan ones that are today part of Turkmenistan, those were absorbed by the Russian Empire. And all of the ones on the eastern flank were absorbed by the British Empire or by the Afghans, who were effectively a British tributary state at this period. And so we have this perspective from Iran that they're being almost eaten from both sides throughout the 19th century. And you can see this in even larger scale from the British-Russian alliance. Now, one of the things that we talked about in some of our previous presentations was that throughout the 19th century, the Russians were coming from the north and the British from the south. But there wasn't actually an alliance between the Russians and the British throughout the 19th century. In fact, their politics were almost at odds with one another. And if you look at the borders of Afghanistan, for instance, the borders of Afghanistan are designed just so that Russia and Britain don't have a border. You can see that very thin sliver that separates British India from what would become the Soviet Union. So what changed fundamentally is that towards the beginning of the 20th century, the British realized that their major threat, or they perceived that their major threat, would be the German Empire. And if the German Empire was the predominant threat to the British on the mainland of the continent, necessarily that would mean allying with other continental powers. Now, Britain and France have been patching up their relationship throughout the 19th century. And France had a historically strong relationship with Russia. And so Britain was pulled into that relationship with the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907. But because these two countries were not allies up until that point, in many cases, Iran would use the power of the British to fight the Russians in the 19th century. A perfect example is in the wars that the Russians were waging coming from the north that would result in the Treaty of Turkmenchai in 1828. The British were the ones primarily supporting Iran in resisting this Soviet invasion. Regardless of this situation, which Iran, at least in the 19th century, could have used to its advantage, we really didn't see that from the rulers of Iran. And one point that really illustrates this is the lack of infrastructure by the beginning of the 20th century. If we look at railroads that were built by Iranians, this map on the left is an indication of the quantity of railroads that exist. And as you can see, there are literally no railroads there, because the only railroad that existed was a 5-mile railroad that is entirely within the city of Tehran as it currently exists, that goes from the center of the capital to the shrine of Shah Abdulazim. That should give you an idea about how minimal the Iranian leaders invested in the development and growth of their country beyond a military perspective. Now, Westerners were not blind to this. They saw the opportunity to make money through the creation of concessions. And this was a way in which primarily the British, but to a lesser extent the Russians, created a sense of power and economic drive within Iran itself. One particularly famous concession was the Reuter concession. And the Reuter concession was originally designed by Baron Paul Julius von Reuter, who was a German Jew. And in this situation, he was given a concession to build a number of different entities, but ultimately he was given control of the Imperial Bank of Persia, the ability to dispense currency within the country. And it should strike us as odd that a country literally is giving all of its power to a foreign entity that they cannot control for the production of their currency. This should show us, especially by the end of the 19th century, the position that Iran was in. And most Iranians took a negative attitude towards this. A lot of this negative attitude came from the religious clerics who painted this kind of domination by foreigners in a religious tone, that this is satanic, that this is overpowering. Now, there's a question here, did the conclusion of the Russo-Japanese War stimulate the Russian desire for alliances? That is absolutely part of what happened in 1907. And Russia was looking for increased partners. That was why the Russians were willing to work with the British from their side. But the Russians were weaker than the British in 1907. And so the focus was more on getting the British in line with asking for help than it was from the Russians. And in fact, the Russo-Japanese War was incredibly persuasive in the Iranian context, because a lot of Iranians saw a kinship between themselves and the Japanese, a foreign non-white power that was resisting the powers of these empires. And they showed that it could be done. In fact, because of those kinds of pressures, we ended up having a revolution in Iran in 1905 and 1906, which I'm going to get into in a bit. One of the last things that we see before that Persian constitutional revolution is what's called the Darcy concession. And this and the discussion around this is going to plague a significant part of this presentation. The Darcy concession was a concession granted to William Knox Darcy, you can see him there, for the possibility of prospecting for petroleum within the territory of Iran. Now, at the time that he bought the concession, there was no known store of petroleum in Iran, and that is why he was able to get a concession for what is effectively 3/4 of the whole country. Now, he spent 8 years, or nearly 8 years, prospecting for oil and only found it in Masjid Soleiman, in the southwestern part of the country, in the region called Khuzestan. And accordingly, the British began to build an oil refinery there and create the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. This company, which would eventually become the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and then later British Petroleum, was a massive creation of both wealth and stability in the acquisition of petroleum for the British. it's really important not to undersell how important this was to the British Empire, because when the British were powering their steamships and their mechanized military through coal, Britain has a significant amount of coal deposits. They were energy secure. But when they began to shift to oil, which is a much more useful and much more storable form of energy, the British were suddenly in a difficult position. And remember that this is in 1901, so this is before any alliance was concluded with the Russians. The possibility of receiving Russian oil was always questionable to the British high elite. And even after 1907, when an alliance was concluded with Russia, it wasn't clear to them that they would consistently have access. They wanted to have a spigot that the Russians couldn't turn off. And so the creation of the Darcy concession and the discovery of petroleum in Masjid-e-Sulaiman was incredibly vital to the British, and something that they would see as fundamental to their national security interests. Of course, from the Iranian perspective, this seemed like another one of these large-scale concessions where foreigners were taking advantage of what is traditionally Iranian-owned property. As we see that influence in 1905, that Iranians come together and these different groups end up working together. The first group that we should talk about are the Mujtahids. The Mujtahids are the Islamic clerical leaders. It's the level just below Ayatollah. And these Mujtahids would exist in numerous different communities. Within the Shiite world, which is very hierarchical, these Mujtahids wielded a significant amount of local community power, even if they didn't have a legally vested title. And the Mujtahids were the ones who presented to the Shah of the Qajar dynasty that they needed a new republic, one that would enforce the Sharia, the Islamic law, which was, of course, very important to them. But they were understanding that in the sense of a justice claim. One of the things we talked about in episode 63, which is about Islamism and Islamic governance, when a lot of Islamic leaders talk about the implementation of the Sharia, what they're envisioning when they say that is not the penal codes that come so quickly to us in the West, but actually the opposite, that there would be a social justice movement, that there would be greater equality for people, that people would have their rights. Because in many cases in the Islamic world, and especially within the Shiite world, the lack of Sharia was seen as an authoritarian system. The Sharia was what gave people rights against authoritarian excesses. We also see the desires for certain political moves, like the removal of the Tehran governor, the creation of an Adalat Khane, or a courthouse, literally a house of justice. So you have all of these different groups, all these different demands made by the Mujtahids, but the Mujtahids didn't operate alone. They also had the bazaar guilds that were supporting them, because as you can see, one of the punishments that was visited on many of the bazaar guilds in the beginning of the 20th century was that they were beaten for trying to circumvent the concessions that had been granted to foreigners. One in particular was the sugar concession. And so you had people being whipped on their feet. It's called the bastinado. People would be whipped on their feet for violating these sorts of codes. And in many cases, this was seen as a violation of justice. And on account of this, you ended up creating what was called the Majlis, or the Iranian parliament. And true to form, the different major power brokers in Iran, the landowners, the ulama, and the bazaar guild, ended up creating their own election parameters to elect the delegates who would then themselves appoint the members of the Majlis. One of the points that we should make here is that if you look at the liberal, moderate, and royalist wings of the Majlis, all three of these people are clerics. The moderate Behbehani and the royalist, and the royalist An-Nuri are both mujtahids. Sayyid Hassan Taghisade, who was the liberal, was clerically trained, he just didn't become a mujtahid. And that should show you that even among the liberals, like Sayyid Hassan Taghi-Zadeh was, they're coming from a clerical background. They're part of this elector class. They're not coming from Western universities. We're going to see some individuals who are coming from Western universities in the future. But it should show you how grounded in the democratic fabric and political fabric of Iran are these Shiite leaders, even at this early stage before the Pahlavi dynasty. Now, the Russians supported the re-authoritarianization of Iran by sending the Persian Cossacks under Vladimirovich Lyakov. And these Persian Cossacks were Persian soldiers. They were part of the Persian kingdom, but they were led and organized by the Russians. And so in many cases, you could see this as Russian influence against an indigenous democratic project. Now, that project was also opposed by the Shah, the king himself, Muhammad Ali. And so Muhammad Ali reached out to Lyakov to actually bombard the parliament. And you can see the remnant of that in the lower right-hand side. For many Iranians, this epitomizes one of the returning themes that we're going to see, is that when there is a democratization, when there is a liberalization, and people get more rights and ability to govern themselves, the either external powers or entrenched powers are going to work together, work on their own or sometimes together in order to reverse that and return Iran to an authoritarian state. And that authoritarian state survived more or less until 1921. And one of the Persian Cossacks, named Reza Khan, was chosen by the British to lead a coup against the Qajar dynasty, using those Persian Cossacks, the same Persian Cossacks that have been used to overturn the constitutional the kingdom that had existed between 1905 and 1908. Now, there are differences in opinion between Iranian sources and British sources as to what degree the British were involved. It's pretty clear that Reza Khan would have led an uprising without British support. He was very much interested in taking power for himself. But Ardashir Ardashir, who was a British agent within Iran, was one of the people who facilitated the relationship between the British, as exemplified by Edmund Ironside, a general in the British military, and Reza Khan in order to facilitate this. It was clear that there was desire on both sides. And Edmund Ironside was of the opinion that the Soviet Union was expanding, right? This is 1921. This is in the sort of the midpoint of the Russian Civil War, where the Soviet Union is beginning to come out on top, and the Bolsheviks are going in every direction. So that British alliance that had been forged in 1907 and survived through most of World War I was dying. And the fear of Russia had returned. And so a weak Iran, a Qajar Iran, because those monarchs were heavily indebted to the Russians. Remember, they overthrew the parliament, was something that the British couldn't tolerate, especially with the fact that oil was still in the Abadan refinery, still in Masjid-e-Soleiman in the southwestern regions of Iran. And so, in his view, a military dictatorship would be better than a weaker state that the Soviets could influence. One of the things that Reza Khan had to deal with within his first power was that power was incredibly decentralized within Iran. And so he spent a significant part of the 1920s literally putting down all these different rebellions. There are two rebellions in particular that I want to focus on, and those are those in the northwestern portion of the country, the portion closest to the Soviet heartland. One of them is the Gilani uprising by Kuchak Khan, And Kuchak Khan was a communist. He was trying to create the Soviet Republic of Iran, at least in the northwestern region of the country, a region that is dominated by a minority, the Azerbaijani Turkish ethnicity. This is in contrast to the rest of Iran, which is majority Persian ethnicity. Now, there was a lot of collaboration between the Soviet leadership and Kuchak Khan, probably best exemplified by the relationship that Kuchak Khan had with Sergo Orjokhonikidze, who was a Georgian communist and one of the leaders behind the communist making of the Caucasus republics, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, when they were reintegrated into the Soviet Union. For those who are interested in that whole story, because that's a much more complex story than we can get into today, episode 49 is where you should go. Now, what ended up here is that eventually, in 1921, Russia signed a treaty of friendship with Reza Khan and cut its losses with regards to Kuchak Khan and the rest of the communists in the north. Another northwestern group that was just to the west of the Azerbaijanis were the Kurds. And similarly, there was a Kurdish rebellion trying to assert more power for the Kurds, especially in the wake of World War I, where the Kurds had been part of the Ottoman military class, let's say, and felt that they should be able to create a nationalistic state of their own. In Iraq, you had Barzanji in 1924 creating a Kurdish state. You also had a rebellion in southeastern Turkey to try and create a Kurdish state, the Azadi rebellion, led by Sheikh Said, and we've talked about those in some of the other conversations. Simko Shikak tried to do the same thing in Iran. And so there was a sense of Kurdish nationalism that existed cross borders. And this was actually really the first time that the Kurds had a consistent national identity across those borders. You can see the letter between Simko Shikak in Iran and Barzanji in Iraq, talking about how they should fight together as creators of a Kurdish national homeland. Unfortunately for the Kurds, none of those rebellions were successful, but it left the sense that there should be a Kurdish national state, even after Reza Khan was able to remove the governing apparatus for the time being. And Reza Khan was notable for his military expansion. The Iranian army was one of the largest armies in the Middle East that was not controlled by a Western power or Russia. You had such a large forcible conscription that significant amounts of farmland in Iran were abandoned. You had over 40% of Reza Khan's budget going to the military. And this resulted in a massive societal orientation around the military that was hard to ignore and that led to a large-scale destabilization in the long term. And Reza Khan was also responsible for trying to centralize the state in, sorry, just give it a second. Reza Khan tried to centralize this in his own person. And so he imprisoned a number of left-wing or center-left individuals like Mossadegh. In fact, he even created a political party, which was Hizb ut-Taraqi, which was supposed to be his own political party, and then he outlawed it in 1932 because he thought it gave too much power to people who weren't him. Despite this, Reza Khan managed to attract to his person an incredible list of effective ministers who, throughout this period, would be either killed, commit suicide under political pain, be forced into exile, or anything else at that moment that Reza Khan was afraid that they would take over the country, take it away from him. And you can even see him there in Persepolis with Muhammad Reza, his son, in Persepolis. Reza Khan wanted to facilitate the rise of a Persian national identity, which was different from the historic way that Iran had been governed. It had been governed as an empire with many different ethnicities. In fact, that was why you had all this regionalism and tension throughout the 1920s. But Reza Khan saw that the way to bring Iran together was to create this kind of Persian identity. And that resulted in the creation of Iran as an entity, both with its name and its own literature and historic continuity. This was really the first time in modern Iranian history that the connection was made between the modern empire of Iran and the historic state of the Achaemenids in Persia, or the historic state of the Seleucids, all of these different Iranian empires that preceded Islam. Much of the narrative during the Qajar period and previous imperial periods had been that Iran was an Islamic country and was part of the Islamic history, and that the pre-Islamic history of Iran was not worth emphasizing. It existed, they didn't deny that it was there, but they saw it as less important, less worthy of reverence, and certainly less culturally significant than the Persian period after Islam had colored the way that it was governed and the way it was organized. And so you begin to see the attempt to vindicate both pre-Islamic civilizations, such as Persepolis and the Tomb of Cyrus, and you see a promotion of Persian language and literature over Arabic, the promotion of Persian scholars and thinkers throughout history that tended to be less inclined towards Islam, like Ferdowsi, who wrote the Shahnameh, which is the history of all the kings of Iran, and he did it in a style of Persian that used as few Arabic words as possible. Today, Arabic is roughly 20 to 25% of the words of Persian, although the syntax is entirely different. Think of it the same way that we can use a lot of words in English from French, but the order of the words in English is very different from the word order in French. Now, because of this, you begin to have a sort of fight breaking out, if you want to say that, between some of those different benefactors. Of course, the mujtahids were not terribly excited by the abandonment of Islam as a primary indicator of Iranian identity, but a number of those who were either modernist or connected to the West or involved in merchantry and trade saw the benefits of this sort of ideology. And so you began to have a split in the population that way. And what further angered the mujtahids was the Kashf-e-Hijab. And the Kashf-e-Hijab was a forcible deveiling of women. One of the ideas that Reza Shah wanted to implement was a uniform form of dress, a Western form of dress, because that was what was modern. Men had to wear hats, women had to expose their hair, and if they didn't, they would have their veils ripped off of them. And this sent a very clear message to the mujtahids. And in fact, this is one of the main reasons why veiling and deveiling is such a very sensitive issue in Iran today. The first instances of deveiling were by and large not by choice, but by force. And even those who believed it should be by choice were in favor of it being by force, because if it wasn't by force, it wouldn't happen at all. Now, there's a question of, is what I'm describing a sort of endemic tension between Islamism and Persian nationalism? I would say absolutely. Persian nationalism has a very secular dimension, and Islamism has a very anti-national dimension. And so the intersection of these 2 points has resulted in a consistent tension between Islamists and Persian nationalists. And we can even see that today, right, where the Islamic Republic of Iran has a huge investment in the political projects in Syria, the political projects in Lebanon, the political projects in Palestine, the political projects in Yemen, all these different proxy wars that the Islamic Republic is fighting. Because from the perspective of the Islamic Republic, those are part of the Islamic world, and therefore it's something that Iran should be contributing to. But from the Persian nationalist perspective, none of those areas are controlled by Persians or Persian-speaking people or have any Persian cultural connection. And so it should be Iran's duty to withdraw from these areas and become a country that deals with the improvement of its own territories. One of the things that we're going to see during the Reza Khan period, and that continues after Reza Khan, is that Reza Khan really took advantage, in the negative sense of that, of the villagers in Iran. Iran, at the beginning of the 20th century, was an extremely rural population. And the way he took advantage of it, through the use of large-scale sharecropping, large-scale forcible conscription, and expropriating more and more income from these regions through increases in taxes to fund the military, which in many cases, right, was forcibly conscripting from these regions, leading to bad harvests, difficulty in maintaining the national foodstuffs, and Reza Khan simply ignored these sort of long-term problems. Reza Khan, however, did promote education, and so you began to see a number of people in the cities beginning to leave and go to foreign countries in order to work. 35% of study abroad students and teachers got scholarships in order to do so, in order to return to Iran and then teach Iranians. You had 800% increases in schools that would basically teach rote memorization, but that is better than nothing. You had the expansion of Tehran University. You even have permission for religious minorities like the Jews to form their own schools that can educate them in their own religious precepts. And of course, as we saw in one of the slides that I skipped, that Iran heavily industrialized during this period as well. And of course, as I mentioned, Reza Khan was completely opposed to any political involvement. So you began to see the rise of political parties, some that are communist, some that are fascist, some that are Islamist, and all of this was happening underground. Because as more Iranians entered the cities, and therefore more Iranians became middle class, they began to want to be involved politically, and Reza Khan forbid that. So when World War II happened, and the British and the French overthrew the Iranian government, that overthrow saw Reza Khan removed from power. And let's just say that there were very few Iranians, even in the halls of government, who had a serious objection to that, despite the fact that it was foreigners doing it. But we should talk about why this happened in the first place. So during World War II, one of the difficulties that the British and the Soviet Union faced is that there was no really effective way to get goods into the Soviet Union. The one way that was generally used was that they would send ships over Scandinavia to try and land in Russian ports on the Arctic Ocean, or they would desperately try to get through the Baltic Sea, but the Germans controlled all sides of that because of their entrenchment in Finland and their entrenchment along the Polish coast. So they wanted a warm water port to get access to the Soviet Union, and Iran seemed an effective way to do it. And so the British and the Soviets coordinated in 1941 to invade in what was called Operation Countenance. And this deposition, as I mentioned, was not something that was terribly unliked. Now, remember, the Reza Khan had one of the largest militaries ever. He spent 40% of the budget on the military, and he conscripted heavily. So the question is, why in less than a month did Iran just collapse? And it's because of stories like that of Colonel Ahmed Nakhjavan. Nakhjavan was a celebrated colonel. He'd fought in several of the internal struggles that Iran had during its unification phase in the 1920s. And he was tasked with a number of different military maneuvers. He objected to the way that Reza Khan was going to do those maneuvers. And so Reza Khan simply removed him from command and court-martialed him. And a number of the other generals took notice and were really not happy with that kind of treatment for reasoned discussion on policy. And so, despite being surrounded by military generals, all of them were pretty much willing to abandon him at the drop of a hat, which is what happened. And the Allies at that time, that's the British and the Soviets, were now going to try and figure out what to do with this new state. They deposed Reza Pahlavi, but it wasn't clear to them exactly how the new government should be formed. And the credit here goes to Muhammad Ali Foroughi, who you can see in the lower right-hand side. Foroughi was somebody who really understood the way that Persian politics ran, and he convinced the British and the Soviets that it would make a lot more sense to keep the dynastic structure of Persia, keep the parliamentary structure, and we should be careful, this parliament was an appointed parliament, more or less. There wasn't really a sense of voting. The parliamentary structure and bureaucratic structure of Iran, in order for the British and the Soviets to not have to rule that much of the country on their own. And that's how he was able to push Muhammad Reza, the young, inexperienced son of Reza Khan, he was in his late teens at the time, to be coronated on the 17th of September, 1941. But it should be very clear that despite Muhammad Reza Shah Pahlavi taking power, he was not really the one in command. A perfect example of this is that during the Tehran conference, which I'm going to talk a little bit about in a second, the Soviet Union's representatives, led by Stalin himself, came to the Marble Palace, which was one of the numerous palaces of the monarchy in Iran. And Iranian troops were not allowed anywhere near the Marble Palace when Stalin was there. In fact, Soviet soldiers were the ones who guarded him at the Tehran conference in Iranian territory and without permission given to them explicitly by the Shah. That should show you how much Soviet power there was. They could literally send their military into the country freely and not have to worry about it. Now, the Tehran conference is that famous conference in 1943 between Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, the leaders of the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States. The United States had entered the war by this point, concerning the future developments of the war. With respect to Iran itself, it contained a very interesting clause, and we're gonna deal with this in a bit, was that at 6 months after all hostilities had ended, all three of those allied powers would remove any military occupational forces that they had in the country in order to allow Iran to return to being an independent country. Because Iran was invaded despite being neutral. It was one of several countries that the Allies invaded despite being neutral. There's a question of, were the Brit-Soviet objectives oil, warm water port, and replacement of a destabilizing government? The government itself wasn't destabilizing. In fact, most Iranian scholars would have argued that Reza Khan would have been able to continue ruling if he hadn't been removed. He was able to effectively eliminate everybody who could oppose him. The problem is, if he died, there'd be nobody to succeed him with his knowledge. And that's effectively where Mohammad Reza shows up. He shows up as basically somebody who, in the 1940s, doesn't know what he's doing. But yes, oil, warm water port, and the next one is actually really important, food. There was a significant amount of food that existed within Iran, and that was grown by the peasant class there. And a significant portion of that food was shipped to the British, to the Soviet Union. So that way, the Soviets could feed themselves, and also some of that was confiscated by the British. And to add insult to injury, a number of things worked together that combined with this to create one of the largest famines in modern Iranian history. The Great Famine resulted where the Allies, the Brits and the Soviets, confiscated all of the rail lines running in Iran to use for the transportation of materiel from the southwest where there were ports, to the northwest, where the Soviet Union could take them from their shared border. And because all these trains were commandeered, it means that the normal trains that would be used to transport grain were not in operation. And it meant that had to go by trucks. But over 70% of the trucks were also commandeered by the Allies, which meant that very little food could get to the people that needed it from what had grown. Combine that with the fact that in 1942 and 1943, there was a large-scale famine just from the problems of the environment. And the fact that the British were confiscating what did grow and the Soviets were confiscating what did grow, it meant that an untold number of people died. We actually don't know. We actually don't know the size of the famine. There are different debates as to how many people it killed. The estimates that I find the most compelling are between 2 to 4 million people. Iran's population during the Reza Khan years was around 15 million people, and it was around 12 million after World War II, which should give us a sense. Now, of course, there are other reasons why people died, so it's hard to take those numbers as a foolproof case, but that should give us a sense of the degree of the calamity. There were also, of course, other strange situations that happened to Iran because Iran was an Allied occupied state. One of them is that there were Jewish children, especially of Polish origin, who ended up in Iran as part of their attempts to escape the Nazi-generated Holocaust in Europe. And so these children, often called the Tehran children, were located in Iran during the war and later allowed to go to Israel as part of that country's independence. But as I mentioned, while it was the case that the Iranians had been promised that all the Allies would withdraw 6 months after the cessation of hostilities in 1945, the Soviets were not terribly willing to follow up. The British and the Americans did withdraw their power, though. The Soviets were in the business of creating satellite states, and many of us are probably familiar with the satellite states that they created in Europe, most notably Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia was an attempted one, but didn't quite succeed, Bulgaria, Romania. All of these different satellite states were created, but we forget that there were satellite states created in other areas. Mongolia was a satellite state of the Soviet Union. Afghanistan was supposed to be a satellite state of the Soviet Union, or at least that was the attempt in 1979. And there were 2 other satellite states. Those are the states of northwestern Iran, which you can see border the Soviet Union. And if we remember, these reflect the territories that wanted independence in the 1920s, among others, but these were the ones where the Soviets had the most clout. The Autonomous Republic of Azerbaijan follows roughly the borders of Kuchek Khan's Gilani state, which was a communist state, and the Republic of Mahabad follows up on Simko Shikak's creation of a Kurdish national state. And so the Russians used these sort of nascent nationalist movements to actually further a communist expansionist power grab. And this seems kind of bizarre because we usually think of communism as a post-national ideal, that it tries to spread around the world and create communist revolutions everywhere. But the Soviet Union found very quickly that the best way to expand communism was not to try to create a single communist international state that would be without nation, without character, but to do exactly the opposite, to create national identities that would ascribe to communist party movements and create communist states. And so the army of Iran, which was still incredibly large, was at the point where it was considering the invasion of these territories to reintegrate them into Iran. But the Soviet Union was sufficiently powerful that Iran didn't know whether or not it would be able to be successful in reintegrating these territories in 1945 or 1946. And this is where Prime Minister Kavam, who you can see over there at the top, enters into the picture in a very interesting way. Ahmed Qavam was known as the Fox because he was able to thread through very difficult diplomatic situations and end up coming out well positioned. In this case, he negotiated with the Soviet Union that they would withdraw their troops, and in exchange, the Iranians would approve of a Soviet oil concession from the territories of the Autonomous Republic of Azerbaijan, which has some oil in it. Now, as soon as the Soviet troops withdrew, the Iranian troops entered and put down whatever local Kurds and Azerbaijanis had been fighting for the autonomy of those regions. And then, of course, the Iranian parliament voted 104-2 to not grant the Soviets the concessions, and the Soviets were now unable to assert their power in these satellite states. That said, the Soviet Union was not out of tricks in terms of asserting its influence within the country, and they helped assist the formation of an Iranian National Communist Party called the Tudeh. Now, if we're thinking about Reza Khan's period, Reza Khan had a parliament, but that parliament was pretty much appointed by him. Following the war, and even during the war to a certain extent, Muhammad Reza Pahlavi did not want to rule as directly or as strenuously as his father did, and believed that the Iranian constitutional period should resume. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that in a second. What's important about that is that it meant that parties like Tudeh, which were clear communist parties, could run in Iran and could have an active supporter base. And Tudeh was able to achieve many goals within its early period in the 1940s in Iranian government. They were able to expand worker protections, get the 8-hour workday, permission to unionize, and other sorts of left-wing demands, often in collaboration with other moderate groups. But the Tudeh party's ability to work within the halls of government abruptly changed in 1949 when an assassination attempt was made on the king. And you can see Muhammad Reza Shah recovering there from that assassination, which took place in February 4th of 1949, sorry, that assassination attempt in February of 1949. At the time, it was unknown who had organized the assassination attempt. It was believed to be Tudeh. Now, looking back on it historically, there is significant doubt as to whether it was Tudeh, and it may have been an Islamist military group like the Fidaiyin, which we'll talk about in a second. But regardless, because it was assumed to be the Tudeh at that time, the Tudeh was made an illegal party. And so its ability to manifest protest and to project Soviet influence diminished somewhat, but Tudeh was still an important force in the streets. They wrote numerous articles in newspapers, they had spokespeople, and of course they worked within the context of labor unions and other sorts of left-wing apparatuses in the economic space. So, as I mentioned, Muhammad Reza Shah's goal was to return to constitutionalism. And so when we have real elections for the Majlis, for the parliament, which takes place in this building here, those elections represent, again, those major power brokers, the landowners, the ulama, the merchants, and the bazaar guild. And so it shouldn't be surprising that we have the exact same people who existed in the 1920s showing up all over again. The 1920s, of course, before Reza Khan removed all the democratic elements of the parliament that had existed under his reign. These are individuals like Ziauddin Tabatabai, who was prime minister in 1921, Ahmed Qavam, who was a prime minister throughout several points in the 1920s, Muhammad Mossadegh, who was a member of the parliament and prime minister on several occasions in the 1920s before being banned from office. They just happen to be 20 years older. And so you have this situation where, because Reza Khan had stymied the creation of any political class, political parties, or political identity, the 1940s were run pretty much like the 1920s would have been if Reza Khan had allowed those democratic processes to unfold. But we should understand that Persia is not a country, Iran, sorry, is not a country at this point that has a total respect for the rule of law. And one of the ways that we see this is in the creation of the Fidaiyan-e Islami. And the Fidaiyan-e Islam, or the Partisans of Islam, was an organization that was a militant terrorist organization operating within Iran, whose goal was to remove any figures that would threaten in a serious way the Islamic presence and Islamic values of Iran. They were led by a charismatic mujtahid who went by the nom de guerre Nawab Safavi, or the Safavid deputy. The Safavids, of course, if we remember from some of our earlier episodes, episode 20, the Safavids were the dynasty in the 16th century that turned Iran Shiite and were an incredibly theocratic governing group. Nawab Safavi commissioned the assassination of numerous people, but there were three who are of particular importance here. Hussein Hajir and Haj Ali Razmara were both prime ministers. Haj Ali Razmara was basically a mouthpiece for Muhammad Reza Shah at that point. But both of these were prime ministers who increasingly secularized Iran and therefore were intentionally assassinated. And Ahmad Kasravi is actually a unique case. Kasravi was an Azerbaijani, so he came from that northwestern region of Iran, that region that had tried to declare independence with Soviet support. But Kasravi argued that Azerbaijanis should become part of a modern Persian ethnicity. He was a Persian nationalist and an ardent secularist as well. He's very famous in particular for the historical books that he's written on numerous difficult topics, especially around World War I and Iranian weakness during that period. In order to prevent him from further disseminating his ideas, Nawab Safavi assassinated him. But Nawab Safavi did not have full clerical authority to do whatever he wanted. In fact, there were a number of mujtahids who considered his actions reprehensible because they were outside of the democratic framework, outside of the rule of law framework. But the most powerful voice among the mujtahids was not of that persuasion. That's Marja Abdul Ghazem Kashani. Now, Kashani was a particular anti-Shah agitator because he believed that the Shah was moving away from Islam as a governing part of his apparatus. In fact, Muhammad Reza Shah was of the view that the country should increasingly become more westernized and move away from this Islamic perspective. And so to the extent that individuals loyal to that mission existed, he allowed Nawab Safavi to act and take out those individuals. In fact, Nawab Safavi was actually executed in 1956 because he attempted a fourth assassination that went sideways and was caught. And we're going to see a lot of Kashani as we go through this discussion because of his pivotal role throughout the development of Islamist Iranian politics. And by Islamism, we're talking about the governance of a country in accordance with the Sharia. So we then get to the petroleum nationalization crisis. And this is one of the most difficult things to talk about when it comes to Iran because of so many different parties operating in the same space. So we start in 1951, and Mossadegh wins his party, the National Front, which is a coalition of different, mostly secular-leaning parties, becomes the largest party in the parliament, and they align themselves with Kashani's Islamist parties that are also in the Iranian parliament, and more importantly, with Kashani's protesters. And they then begin to try and negotiate with the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. They point out that the Americans had made a 50-50 deal with Venezuela in order to extract Venezuelan oil, and they wanted the same 50-50 profit-sharing deal. The British company could still own the vast bulk of the apparatus. But the profits would be shared 50-50. The British refused because from the British perspective, any loss of control over this oil could spell doom for the British Empire. They were still thinking from that perspective of that expansionist empire, and they couldn't imagine a future where they didn't have one. So starting in August of 1951, the British, led by first Prime Minister Clement Attlee and then later by a resurgent Churchill, began to blockade Persia, refusing entry to their goods through economic sanctions, and also literally blockading later in the year by sending military warships to the Persian Gulf to prevent any oil tankers from leaving Khuzestan and the Abadan refinery therein without British approval. Now, in spring of 1952, the British decided that what they're going to try and do is just buy the Iranian election and therefore be able to, without taking any desperate military maneuvers, remove Mossadegh from power. And so they send money to a number of different mob bosses, people like Sha'ban Jafari, who you can see there, in order to try and control the Iranian election. That doesn't happen. Mossadegh remains prime minister because he was significantly popular, and it was very difficult to unseat him. We then move to Mossadegh getting into more and more disputes with the Shah. The Shah originally supported Mossadegh's attempt to naturalize the oil, but by July of 1952, Mossadegh was asking for the power to operate the defense ministry. But the defense ministry was not necessarily in his purview. He could ask for it, but the Shah saw this as him trying to get too much power, and so it turned the two of them against each other. Then you see the events of 30 Tir. So there were 5 days of protest in order to try and force in order to force Mossadegh's government to withdraw, and Mossadegh survives this. And then he uses emergency powers to begin clamping down on his enemies as a result of the protest of 30 Tir. But a lot of those powers he also seems to use to go after Kashani supporters, because Kashani is trying to make the country more Islamic, and he has an alliance with Mossadegh as long as Mossadegh is trying to eject British influence. But he doesn't agree with Mossadegh's secular agenda. And so in the fall of 1952, as the two of them are fighting each other politically, Kashani loses Mossadegh and has to rely more and more on Tudeh, on the Soviet-influenced communists. Now, during this period, actually, the United States is still trying to negotiate with Mossadegh. They see him as a better fit for long-term American approaches in the region than the British. The Democratic Party under Truman is very strongly anti-imperialist and sees the retrenchment of, the entrenching that the British are doing of imperialist actions as against the idea of the United Nations and increasing independence for formerly colonized states. But when Eisenhower becomes US president in 1953, his Republican administration looks completely differently at the situation and sees that Tudeh Mossadegh alliance, which is beginning to dominate, to be a real threat to Iran turning communist. Now, most analysts at the time were quite sure that Mossadegh was not communist and the Tudeh influence would not make him communist, but it didn't matter. There were enough policymakers and decision makers who saw the rise of Tudeh, especially as Kashani became more and more antithetical to Mossadegh, to be worthy of fear. And so what ends up happening is that the Americans are willing to talk to the British about the possibility of launching a coup in Iran in order to remove Mossadegh from power and prevent Tudeh from achieving their ends. From the British perspective, it's to protect their oil interests and their large empire. From the American interest, it's to prevent the domino theory. But they get allies within Iran to support them. Kashani reaches out to the British and is willing to protest against Mossadegh because of his lack of pro-Islamist sense. And Fazlullah Zahidi, who was a general within the Iranian military, was willing to work with the Americans because he believed in the strength of the monarchy. And so Operation Ajax was conceived. What was originally going to happen was that the Americans were going to get a message to Mossadegh that he was no longer the prime minister and that Fazlullah Zahidi was the prime minister at the Shah's request. The Mossadegh, probably through Tudeh, finds out about this and avoids receiving the message. And so the Shah actually ends up fleeing the country because he's afraid that Mossadegh will consolidate power against him, now knowing that the Shah is after his job. As a result, you have a large-scale protest in favor of Mossadegh by the Tudeh party, which begins to torch areas controlled by other parties and other militants. And Mossadegh uses his power, the police power, to try and curtail Tudeh from destroying the country. So Mossadegh has removed Kashani as an ally by trying to be too secular. He's removed Tudeh as a strong ally by restricting the influence of their militants. He's removed the Shah as an ally because he didn't comply with his request to stand down as prime minister. So he really has nobody left. So when the British and the Americans pay, again, people like Shahban Jafari, these mob bosses, to create a riot on the 19th of August, and combine that with Kashani's own Islamist protesters, Fazlullah Zahidi is able to take power, the Shah returns, and the coup is successful in returning the Shah to power and preventing the nationalization of the Abadan refinery. There's a question out in here that is really interesting, and I'm going to address that in the Q&A because I don't think it's directly pertinent. There is a question here, though. Do you think that Eisenhower's foreign policy decisions were inordinately and accurately influenced by what he later warned against as the military-industrial complex in which he lumped the CIA? I don't know if it's as much of that as just British influence. The British made a very compelling case to the Eisenhower administration that the Tudeh party would bring communism to Iran. And he bought that argument when Truman hadn't. So it's not so much the military-industrial complex as it just happened to be the person they were talking to. And it sort of goes to, one of the, the point that I think that a lot of people are motivated by ideologies, but it also depends on who that person is and where they're sitting. Now, at the time that this occurred, it wasn't clear that the British and the Americans had done all these activities. They had done many of them in secret through large cash transfers and the similar. And the full extent of Operation Ajax, which was the American CIA operation that resulted in Zahidi taking power on the 19th of August, 1953, this information only came out in the 1990s and early aughts with the clarity that we now have. But given the quantity of foreign influence that had existed in Iran, from the British to the Soviets to the Americans throughout the last 2 centuries, as soon as something happened, the Iranians pointed fingers at the British and the Americans from the motivation of quo vadis, right? Who benefits? And this coup of 1953 has remained in Iranian minds as the quintessential symbol of foreign influence in Iran. And while the Shah had been willing to entertain the possibility of a true democracy or a parliamentary monarchy, let's say, during the period from 1941 to 1953, as soon as this coup happened, he was no longer as willing to permit people to freely vote. And this fundamentally shifts Iran towards an authoritarian position. So we then see, especially across the 1960s and 1970s, incredibly high military spending as the Shah begins to see the need for the creation of a complete and total control of the country. We also see the creation of two new political parties, the only political parties that are really allowed to run. And in fact, these two political parties will coalesce into one party in the 1970s, the Novin and the Mardom parties. The Novin party is usually translated as the National Party, and the Mardom party is usually translated as the People's Party. But they have been jokingly called by most Iranians the Yes Party and the Yes Sir Party, in the sense that both of them were incredibly loyal to the Shah, were effectively his mouthpieces, and did not represent any constituency of the major constituencies that we've talked about. They don't represent the Islamists, they don't represent the landowners, they don't represent the bazaar or merchant guilds, they don't represent the increasingly large new populations. They represent the will of the Shah in the form of multiple people. And we also see the disbandment of all of the other previous political parties. The National Front, which was the coalition of groups that Mossadegh had headed, was completely disbanded. Mossadegh himself was tried and placed under house arrest, where he died in 1963. Zahidi, who had been the general who took power in the coup, was dismissed by the Shah, but it was a mutually understood dismissal in the sense that Zahidi wanted to give power back to the king. And of course, in line with the American fear of communism, in fact, America becomes the dominant foreign power in Iran after 1953, where the British are minimized to their control of Abadan and the surrounding area. The Americans seem to have a much greater hand in the policies of Iran. The Tudeh supporters are directly persecuted. And when we talk about persecution, that goes hand in hand with the discussion of the Savak, which was founded in 1957 and was supposedly disbanded. And I say that because I believe that the Iranian Savama, which existed from 1979 until the early aughts, and then was renamed again, was the Islamic Republic's incarnation of this organization, despite heavy protests from the Islamic Republic on that front. But the Savak is a secret police, and it was a brutal secret police that had the knack of finding very effectively and torturing very effectively dissidents to the regime. The Savak received training from both the CIA and the Israeli Mossad in terms of finding problematic persons in Iran, problematic political figures in Iran, and removing them from the calculus. Now, the picture below is, of course, propaganda in a certain sense. It's published by Khomeini and Khamenei on Khamenei's official website. So we should understand where it's coming from. But at the same time, it's one of the few close to accurate depictions, at least that I've seen, of the Evin prisons, which were the deepest, darkest prisons controlled by the Savak during the Shah's reign. And many dissidents were beaten, tortured, and other ways mutilated in order to prevent them from expressing their political will under the rule of the Shah. In fact, the situation was so deleterious that Amnesty International considered it one of the 5 worst countries for human rights in the 1970s. There were some Islamists that were some mujtahids who were willing to forego sort of an Islamist power structure and were willing to maintain a place within Muhammad Reza Shah's country. Marja Boroujerdi was probably the closest of these, the one with whom the Shah had the least friction. Kashani was definitely not one of those. Kashani and the Shah had numerous points of friction, and while Kashani was never directly imprisoned, he didn't live to see the Shah overthrown. He died in 1962. And so we have to understand further Iran's context within the wider Cold War. In 1955, Iran joins the British in what is effectively an American-led pact. Even though America is not a member, it's obvious to everybody involved that the Americans are supporting the Baghdad Pact, which is a British-run organization, to prevent the expansion of communism south into the Middle East. And because of this, and because of this, Iranian troops are operating in part of that alliance against the communists. We also see the relationship develop between Iran and Israel, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But Iran-Israeli relations should be understood in much the same way as American-Taiwanese relations, in that Iran never recognized Israel by what we mean official diplomatic recognition. But Iran had dealings with Israel as early as 1950. They exchanged ambassadors, or whatever the proper term for that would be, a cultural attaché, government members, what have you. And they had an incredible amount of trade and military alliances. In fact, Iran and Israel saw eye to eye on the threat coming from Arab countries. And so Iran became part of Israel's alliance of the periphery, along with Turkey, which was also a member of the Western alliances, and in particular NATO. Just like how Iran had its northwest territories subject to a possible Sovietization, the northeastern part of Turkey was subject to the same threats until Turkey became part of NATO and the Soviet Union retreated, which brought those two countries into a closer and closer alignment. Further to that, we're going to see that Iran and Egypt have very fractious relations because of Egypt's increasing closeness to the Soviet Union and how it places them relative to Iran with its strong American support. During the Shah's rule from 1953 until 1979, we also have a massive change within the Iranian population. If we look at 1956, which is only 3 years after the coup, and compare that to 1976, which is 3 years before the Islamic Revolution, the urbanized population jumps from around 31% to around 48%. In fact, between the year 1972 and 1973, the rate of urbanization jumped internally within the country 8% on what had previously been in the year before. And so you had large numbers of people moving to the cities from the countryside. They were trying to look for jobs. They were trying to look for livelihoods. And what you end up seeing is the creation of two Teherans, Tehran being, of course, the capital of Iran. In the northern part of the city, which is where the middle classes and upper classes used to live, people would be dressed in modern Western fashions. Many women would go unveiled. And the wealth that you could see in certain parts of northern Tehran was so egregious that it put a lot of places in Western Europe to shame. And then you had the far more expansive rural southern Iran, and that's the lower city. And you can see how different it is. I mean, this is a picture from the modern day Islamic Republic, but it should give you an idea about how decrepit the houses are, because in a lot of cases, this hasn't changed, how beaten up the roads are. And so these farmers who are moving from the countryside into the cities to try and find some job for themselves would end up in this lower city and be placed only with a few miles away from extravagant wealth that they couldn't understand and connect to by a people who were significantly more secularized than they were. It was these two countries placed smack dab next to each other. in what created a huge sense of mental dislocation, because they don't understand what this northern Tehran is. It doesn't look like anything that they're familiar with. And also a sense of alienation, that they've been removed and uprooted from the farms and communities that they lived in for centuries, and now they're in the cities looking for jobs. Now, of course, similar trends have occurred in the West. We had large-scale urbanization, but that took place over the course of roughly 7 generations, from the early 19th century to the mid-20th century. And because it happened slowly over the course of all these generations, people were able to slowly adapt and change the way they lived and understand new communities and build these things slowly but surely in order to secure their place in a new environment. In the case of Iran, these tools didn't exist. And so the massive dislocation resulted in a cataclysmic understanding of their place in society and what kind of community they could look for. And so this made it prime opportunity for established figures in Tehran's lower city to expand their influence. And the most predominant group, the only one that the Shah did not target with complete impunity with the Savak, were the Shiite preachers, the mujtahids. And so you end up creating this situation where people who are looking for work, looking for a new livelihood, are increasingly put in direct contact with the mujtahids, swelling their ranks and allowing the mujtahids to communicate a vision of a moral Iran that is fundamentally at odds with what they're seeing under the rule of the Shah. Now, there's a comment here that by the 1970s, there were a significant number of Iranian upper middle class students studying in American colleges. That's absolutely correct. And that's part of what led to their westernization. But you should imagine the cultural conflict that was occurring because of this forcible reconnection. And you can see from the population, it rose from roughly 15 million in 1950 to nearly 40 million in 1980, right? That's over, it's nearly a 3 times multiplier over a course of just 30 years. Now, the Shah tried to do a number of reforms in order to improve the situation of Iranians. Probably the most famous of these was the land ownership reform was the White Revolution. And the White Revolution had a number of internal pieces to it. I'm going to talk about 3 of them because they're relatively important. The first one is the land reform. And in the Shah's land reform, he wanted to provide land ownership documents for a number of Iranian citizens who had previously not owned significant portions of land. They'd owned smaller pieces of land, but not large enough pieces. This, of course, had the problem of alienating the landowners, because a lot of the landowners' lands were purchased by the state or simply carved up without purchase and reallocated to the different populations throughout Iran. Now, for some people, it worked out relatively well. They were able to get enough land parcels in order to be self-sufficient. But there were a lot of problems with this. The first one is that over 2/3 of the people who received land allocations didn't receive enough land in arable enough area to actually become independent. So they had to end up selling their land anyway, usually to a large landowner who had the wealth to reacquire it, and go into the cities where they'd be part of this urban dislocation. Another serious issue with it is that it failed to notice that a significant portion of Iranians, especially during the reign of Reza Khan, had become sharecroppers. They didn't own any land. And so since they didn't own any land, they weren't given any land, because the only people that could acquire land ownership were people who already had some land ownership. This would expand their holdings. So the sharecroppers, similarly, were not improved by this law and were bothered by the fact that they were, for want of a better term, exempted. And the last problem that it had is that you had an issue of mechanization. Now, the Shah wanted to improve the mechanization of Persian and Iranian agriculture. And so if you brought mechanized elements into the production of agriculture, you didn't have to give up as much of your land as you would otherwise. But of course, mechanization replaces labor. And as the population is skyrocketing, the mechanization effectively means that there will be more and more farmers without jobs, again, leading to that urban dislocation. You further have the question of voting. Now, voting had existed in Iran. We mentioned, of course, that after 1953, we have the yes and yes sir parties, the Nevin and Mardom parties. But starting in 1963, women are given permission to vote for the first time in Iranian history, a right that women, for the most part, still have. But this was an earth-shaking event, and of course, the Mujtahids did not find much in that they approved of. And finally, the last piece was the literacy core. The Shah wanted to increase the literacy of many of the populations in Iran, and so he created this group in order to improve education for those who were illiterate. It was met with modest success, but overall, it didn't stem the large-scale situation that people didn't have the skills and training necessary to get more advanced jobs, which is what they were really looking for. So there's a question here, do you see a parallel with the Republic of Turkey, a social structure in which secular Western-oriented elite controlled an agrarian religious population? I see some similarities. I would say the fundamental distinction, and that made Turkey work in a way that Iran never did, was that Ataturk had proven himself in war. He had saved Turkey from being carved up by foreign imperialists. And therefore, he had the legitimacy from the conservative side of the country that even if he wasn't religious and even if he violated all these norms, he, by military might, demonstrated his right to rule and his right to control the narrative. Muhammad Reza Shah was exactly the opposite. He was seen by many to be in control, under the control of Western, the imperial powers, in particular, in this case, the Americans, but that the imperial powers were really the ones guiding Iran. And so he wasn't respected as a leader. And so because he wasn't respected, anything he did wasn't worthy of respect. I would also say that Turkey had a much larger percentage of its population being educated. We have to remember, with the arrival of the Muhajir, who were those refugees from the Balkans, who were disproportionately more educated than the Anatolian population, you had a group of educated population that could settle in Istanbul, that could settle in Ankara, and could direct Turkish society along the lines that Ataturk was imagining. Now, you begin to see the Mujtahids circling around the White Revolution because of its secularizing influence, the rise of women in the process of voting. You can see women were represented in the literacy corps. You also see the increasing dislocation. This leads to a new crop of Mujtahids who are younger and who are responding to the situation in order to call attention to the lack of Islam in the political structure. And one of Kashani's students was a man named Ruhollah Khomeini, who had become a marja in his own right, and on the 15th of Khordad led an uprising against the Shah. For that, he was imprisoned and eventually sent into exile in Iraq. In the protest that he was leading, he argued strongly against the Shah's collusion with Israel, the Shah's collusion with the Americans. He argued against this modernization and all of the ways that Iran was changing, in his view, fundamentally against the religious tenets of Islam. We should also talk about the economic changes in the country. One of the things that is worth pointing out is that Iran's economy began to boom in the 1960s, and you can see that jump there in the circle. And while this is GDP per capita, we should be very careful to understand how GDP per capita works. GDP per capita is an average. So if one person makes $1 million and two other people make $2, the GDP per capita is still $333,333 per person, even though that's not representative in any way of how the economy is actually split. And that's a really good case here. Almost starting in the 1950s, the Shah was able to renegotiate with the British to create a 50-50 oil profit-sharing agreement. The exact thing that Mossadegh was trying to do in 1951 before the whole coup process started. And with American pressure that the British accepted. And that led to an incredible amount of money entering Iran. That led to an increase in military spending. In fact, there are certain models of tank that existed in greater numbers in the Shah's army than in the British army, despite them being British tanks. He bought military equipment from the Americans, the latest in their Air Force, military equipment from the British, as much as he could. He expanded the size of the military till it was nearly as big of an albatross around his neck as it had been for his father. And he also created wealth funds for himself and his family in the billions of dollars. While, as we pointed out, with southern Tehran, you had large-scale urban poor that were subject to the pressures of having difficulty finding jobs. Iran was, of course, assisted in the growth of its economy by the price of oil, since oil was the largest single element of Iran's economy, and Iran's economy really couldn't survive without it. When the Arab oil embargo hit in 1973, the price of oil doubled, and Iran stood to gain from that. The price doubled again a little bit later because of other issues related to the dispensation of oil. And so what ended up happening is that the economy kept overheating. You had too much money chasing far too few goods produced in the country, leading to high prices and inflation. And of course, that inflation is going to disproportionately affect the CPI, those standard goods that normal Iranians are going to consume. So while the wealth was coming into the country, it wasn't helping the Iranians to live a better life. And in fact, it was actually worsening the lives of many Iranians because of the price differentials. There are a few comments, and I'm going to address those in the question and answer time because there's not really a question attached to them. All right, so we start seeing a large-scale American expatriate population in Iran. At its height, it becomes up to 50,000 people, 10,000 in the city of Isfahan alone. And the American expatriate population, we should understand in its full context. So this picture, again, is from Khamenei's website, and it illustrates one of Khomeini's favorite speeches that he gave in 1964, just before he was arrested by the Savak and deported from the country following torture in Evin prison. And this speech basically said that Americans were subject to American law in Iran, more or less, and that the dog of an American is worth more than the Shah himself, and the dog of an American will receive better legal treatment than the Shah himself, never mind actual Iranians living in their own country. Now, the Americans were living in compounds. These compounds were surrounded by walls, and Americans, by and large, did not interact with normal day-to-day Iranians. In fact, they would go shopping at the US commissary, which was the biggest in the entire world at this time, and they would live almost entirely bubbled lives. The American school in Tehran was one of the only American schools in the world where the local population that wanted to study there was not permitted to do so. Only Americans and their children could study there, and passports were checked upon enrollment. There were discussions throughout the 1960s and 70s about including some history of Iran in the school subjects, which was met by almost consistent parental disapproval with the slogan of "Keep Iran Out." There are particularly nasty stories about how strongly Iran was kept out of American enclaves within Iran. One particularly sad story is that there had been a car accident, and an Iranian man had brought his severely injured son to the American-run hospital in order for him to be patched up, and he was sent away and told to go to an Iranian hospital because he wasn't an American citizen and therefore shouldn't be at that hospital. Similarly, when the American hospital had a shortage of nurses and was willing to hire Iranian nurses to fill those positions, those Iranian nurses were not allowed to eat in the canteen and had to eat in the janitor's closet. One other thing that we should discuss, and I couldn't find a good place to put it, is the treatment of minorities under the Shah. And we can separate these minorities into two general buckets: religious minorities and ethnic minorities. When it comes to religious minorities, they ended up rather well off under the Shah, certainly better than they had been during the Qajar period or many of Iran's previous periods. We've talked about, for example, how in the 19th century, the Jews of Iran and the Baha'i of Iran suffered an incredible amount of persecution. That was not the case under Muhammad Reza Pahlavi. These individuals were allowed to build their own centers of worship, were protected from violence by people in the street, and were allowed to pray in whatever languages they saw fit. In fact, many of these rights that occur, especially to Baha'i and other post-Islamic religions, would be significantly curtailed by the Islamic Republic. Zoroastrianism, Assyrian Christianity, Armenian Christianity, and Judaism are recognized religions in the modern Islamic Republic of Iran, but they have significantly far fewer rights in terms of their own schools, organizations, voting, and so on than they did during the time of the Shah. When it comes to ethnic minorities, however, the Shah worked assiduously to prevent ethnic nationalism, pulling back to that Persian nationalism of his father and trying to create a unified Iranian identity. It's also worth talking for a bit about Iranian foreign policy. And so there's a few places that I want to focus on. I've mentioned Israel a few times, but I really want to point out what the Iranian-Israeli relationship was. If we are familiar with the Arab-Israeli War of 1967, also called the Six-Day War, people forget why Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egypt. Sure, in May of 1967, the Egyptians forced out the United Nations Expeditionary Force, which had been sitting in the Sinai Peninsula, as sort of a buffer force between the Egyptians and the Israelis. But the Israelis were quite sure that the Egyptians probably wouldn't attack until November of 1967. The reason that Israel declared war on Egypt on June 5th of 1967 is because Egypt began to blockade the Straits of Tiran. You can see them here, and they're called the Straits of Tiran typically because they have these multiple different islands that exist and a very thin passageway through which they can get through, which means that it's very easy to blockade. Now, why would a blockade of Israel's southernmost port be an issue from an Israeli perspective? Certainly, it doesn't stop the Americans or the British or the French, which were their Western allies at that point, from reaching them because they can come over the Mediterranean. What it does, though, is that it stops Iranian oil shipments from coming in, because the Iranian oil shipments always came through Eilat, Israel's southernmost port. The Iranians did not want to go through the Suez Canal if they could avoid it. In fact, during the 1960s, the Iranians actually worked with the Israelis to build what was known as the Ashdod Eilat pipeline to pipe oil through Israel for transport over the Mediterranean to avoid paying the fees of going through the Suez Canal. So the Iranians were only willing to send oil to Israel through the southern port. And when Egypt blockaded that and Israel stood to lose over 90% of its incoming oil, that's when they launched their preemptive strike, because they knew that if they waited until November, they wouldn't have enough oil to prosecute the war. As I mentioned as well, Israel and Iran coordinated on defense pacts as well. Israel, in addition to the Mossad teaching the Savak how to operate, Israel also provided training for Iran's general military and helped facilitate the arrival of American military supplies to Iran. You also see, you can see, for example, the Iranian is training at Beit Barel College in Kfar Saba, which is in Israel, along with a number of other foreigners who are learning modernization techniques and agricultural techniques in Israel. The Iranian-Egyptian relationship is rather turbulent. During the reign of Gamal Abdullah, during the reign of King Farouk, which he was expelled from Egypt in 1952. But during the reign of King Farouk, relations between Egypt and Iran were rather cordial. In fact, the Shah's first wife, Princess Fawzia, was from the Egyptian monarchy. Of course, those who have read any amount of detail about Muhammad Reza Shah's life know that Prince Fawzia was not terribly happy with her marriage. And in fact, she returned to Egypt quite saddened. But when Gamal Abdel Nasser overthrew the king and began to assert power for himself, especially in line increasingly with Soviet interests, the relationship between them soured mightily. And Iran's support of Israel didn't help matters. When Nasser was replaced by Sadat, the relationship changed in 1970. The relationship changed almost overnight. Sadat and the Shah had much better relations, especially when Sadat was entering the American sphere of influence increasingly throughout the 1970s, and therefore became a notable ally. We also saw, when we talk about Oman, that the Iranians had a strong relationship with the king of Oman, and helped him put down an uprising in the Dhofari Mountains in the western part of the country. Now, the Iranian forces, Iran sent a total of 4,000 soldiers, was the first real power projection that Iran had ever done. And they did it. They did it in 1973 in order to demonstrate that they could. They had all this equipment from the Americans, from the British, this large military, and they wanted to show that they had the power to do what they needed to do. And they justified it by the fact that the Omanis controlled the southern side of the Strait of Hormuz, whereas the Iranians control the northern side. And if those barbarians in the Dhofar region took control, Iran would be unable to secure the passage of its own oil tankers out into the Persian Gulf, out of the Persian Gulf and into the Indian Ocean. In 1971, 2 years earlier, Iran did a much smaller operation to take territory from Ras Al Khaimah, one of the 7 members of the United Arab Emirates. And they did that through taking the islands of the Greater and Lesser Tund. These islands were small fishing islands. The entire operation resulted in 3 Persian deaths, 4 Emirati deaths, and a continuing litigation, despite the fact that the Islamic Republic is litigating the same issue that the Shah was litigating, that was litigated against the Shah when he took those islands by force. Oman and Iran have since that point maintained very cordial relations and positive relations, because the entire existence of the current Omani government is indebted to this Iranian movement in Dhofar. One of the particular extravagances that really shows why the Shah was so detested by a significant portion of the population was the 2500th anniversary celebration of the monarchy in Iran. So in 1971, at the tomb of Cyrus and in Persepolis at large, Muhammad Reza Shah Pahlavi invited leaders from all over the world, giving precedence to royals as opposed to democratically elected leaders, to come and celebrate the 2500th year of Iranian monarchy, citing as the first year of that monarchy the rule of Cyrus the Great. Numerous projects were built in Iran, such as the Shah Tower, which has been renamed by the Islamic Republic as the Azadi Tower, and contained the Museum of Iranian History inside of it, an entire tent city for all of the foreign dignitaries, wine, caviar, expensive foods for all the delegates in attendance, and was a show of wealth that cost the equivalent of one entire year's GDP for the country. Suffice it to say, the large poor population of the country did not take well to this spending of money. And for many, this has become the symbol of the Shah's poor economic decisions in terms of how he ran the country. And so we get to the final years of the regime, and we have attempts of the conflict between the Savak and the ulama. Now, we mentioned that the Savak was able to take apart the Tudeh, the Communist Party, the National Front, which was sort of the liberal democratic side of government, the Fidaiyan, which were the Islamic militants, but they couldn't go after the ulama. And they couldn't go after the ulama because the ulama were simply too numerous and too entrenched. The Shah even tried to create a Diyanet, which was something that worked in the Turkish case. This would be an official state-run mosque, but the ulama resisted, and eventually the plan was scrapped. The ulama, because of their entrenchment in the poorer communities and their ability to create those networks for those dislocated people, had a large swelling of followers, despite not necessarily being as left-wing or as modern as some of the other objectors to the Shah's reign, such as those few Tudeh and National Front people who still survived, and the young students who took their message despite not being official members. You also, because of the overheating of the economy, had the Shah trying to resolve the situation by arresting or beating Bazaris using the Savak for what he called price gouging. But the rise in prices and inflation was due to the large-scale money inflowing to the country from the oil. It had nothing to do with what the Bazaris were doing. They were responding to the natural conditions. So they were increasingly inflamed. So you had the landowners who were angered because their lands were confiscated under the White Revolution's land reform. You had the Bazaris who were enraged because a number of their members were arrested and tortured on the premise that they were inflating prices, even though they had no control over that. You had the ulama who were angered by the destruction of the Fidaiyan and the attempt to centralize away their power. And you had the National Front and similar liberal aligned individuals who were bothered because of the human rights abuses of the Savak in attacking all the other groups. So the Shah, by the late 1970s, had alienated just about every major constituency that Iran had. And one of the ironies here, at least to my view, is that the Israeli Mossad picked up on this as early as 1975. The American CIA refused to admit these reports throughout the late 1970s and all, and were utterly dumbfounded when the revolution came into full swing in 1978. The reason for this is that they had so much trust in the Savak, which they had trained, that they assumed that the Savak's reports were accurate about the situation, and the Savak, responding to the Shah, would never say anything negative, so that way they wouldn't be subject to their own punishment and torture. And so we enter from late 1977 to early 1979, the period of the Islamic Revolution, or the Iranian Revolution. We begin having large-scale manifestations throughout the country calling for the resignation of the Shah, and the shift of the country to some sort of other system. It's not clear from the protesters exactly what they want, but you have different groups represented. You had those who were pro-Khomeini. Khomeini was, of course, living in exile at this point, right? First he was in Iraq, and eventually he made his way to France in 1978. You have those from the Tudeh party or from national liberal groups, feminists, and so on, who are more left-wing and want a sort of parliamentary system. But either way, because of all these constituencies that the Shah had alienated, they wanted him out. And a number of these protests eventually led to violent recriminations. One in particular was the Cinema Rex fire, which occurred on the 19th of August. Prior to September 11th, this was the single largest terrorist event in the history of the world, in like the modern era, where over 400 people died because they were locked into a burning building. Now, at the time, it was believed by most people that the Shah had caused this. It appears under further historical investigation that it was done by Islamist militants. Regardless, events like this and the lack of confidence that the Shah would be an honest arbiter of information meant that they blamed him anyway, and this further agitated revolts. And there were numerous altercations throughout 1978. Muhammad Reza Shah promised that he would create new democratic parties, reinstitute voting. At this point, it really didn't matter. People were dead set on replacing him. And Mehdi Bazargan, who represented the National Front, actually went to Paris to meet with Khomeini and discuss the possibility of creating an alliance between the National Front and the Islamists to overthrow force the abdication of the Shah and create a new parliamentary system that would be Republican. And it seemed by January of 1979 that the Western allies, you can see the Guadeloupe Conference there with the leaders of the United States, France, Britain, and I'm trying to remember the fourth member, and probably Germany, discussing the future of Iran and recognizing, at least in their view, that it would be better if Iran became an Islamist country than if it became a communist country. And so this collusion with Khomeini and the National Front was preferable to a collusion that could have occurred with Tudeh. And they allowed, yeah, somebody's reminding me, it's Helmut Schmidt, sorry, it's Schmidt of Germany, yeah. That would be better for preventing the expansion of communism. And so Khomeini was able to return to Iran on the 1st of February 1979, and Mehdi Bazargan became his prime minister. And that exactly sets us where we should be to talk about the events of 1980 and the creation of the Islamic Republic. The Shah, of course, had abdicated in mid-January of 1979. He flew to Egypt, and he was buried there. He died a few years later. His son, Reza Pahlavi II, was in the United States at the time, going to university, and he has since remained in the United States and been a cultural figure for Iranians in the diaspora. So, while we're formulating some questions for the question and answer period, and I'll address some of the comments in the thread, I'd like to tell you a little bit about who we are. So, We are History Mostly Ancient Discussions. Tonight was part of the Middle Eastern History Group, and we meet every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Of course, next week we're going to finish our story about modern Iran, talking about the Islamic Republic and how it moved on from this time. And some of the things that we've talked about during the Reza Khan years, the Qajar years, will start coming back up, as well as those in the Muhammad Reza Shah Pahlavi years. We also have presentations weekly on Asian philosophy by Jason Peng. Aaron and I periodically will do a series on European Union security. Jane and John do series on powerful women in the languages respectively. And there are other groups that we do periodically. We recently had a discussion on the Ukrainian war on the 3rd of June, and we'll probably pick up with that in about 3 months. And of course, we have all these other series that are completed that you can see on our website, the YouTube page you can see here. So if you want to speak and ask your question auditorily, please raise your hand and I will unmute you. If it's the case that you prefer to write your question in the chat, that's fine too. And I'm just going to go through the chat and read out some of the comments and just sort of opine on them a little bit. So let's see.
Richard, while you're reading the comments, this was really bugging me. I remember that Mossad and Israeli air defense system actually detected that Ravi, the Shah was developing a nuclear weapon.
Yes.
And to stop it, they had attacked the nuclear development area. So how true it is? Can you speak a little bit about it?
That Iran was working on developing a nuclear weapon?
Yeah. Well,
yeah, it's relatively non-controversial that Iran was working on a nuclear weapon. In fact, the United States was actively assisting Iran with the development of nuclear energy technology during the time of the Shah. And in fact, this underlines a lot of what the Islamic Republic calls the Western hypocrisy on the question of Iranian nuclear weapons, because they were perfectly fine with Iran having them when they were in the Western sphere, right? When Iran is not in the Western sphere, then they're bothered by the principle. But no, Iran was already in the process of building nuclear reactors by the late 1970s, and there was a lot of discussion among the Western allies as to whether it would be okay or acceptable if Iran had, if Iran had that kind of capability.
Right. I understand. And another question I have while you're going through is this practice of I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing Batinia, and then therefore having the live wall that will go toward the Iraqi forces during the Iraq-Iran war. What is it all about? Why would people sign up to be killed in this live wall? I mean, how did it come about?
Well, we're definitely going to talk about the Iran-Iraq war next week. That's going to be a huge part of it. Suffice it to say, if you train people up for the concept of martyrdom, they will go to heaven and achieve a world of paradise, and you will financially secure their parents in this life. That goes a long way towards motivating people, especially if they're young children who can be easily brainwashed. Wesley, you have a question? Hi, Wesley, you have a question?
Can you hear me?
Yes,
yeah,
we can hear you now.
Oh, great. Okay, that's great, Richard. Yeah, good presentation. Yeah, it's just remarkable, but not surprising at all. Post-World War II, and it continues, how as long as, let's just say, you're in the back pocket of the United States and UK and other NATO satellites, we'll let you, play ball, kind of run your show, think nothing of putting nuclear missiles north of Tehran on the Caspian, which triggered the Khrushchev to put some missiles in Cuba, which didn't come out, of course, until quite a bit post Cuba Missile
I was going to
Crisis.
say, no, I think you're confusing missiles in the north of Turkey. I don't believe the United States put missiles in the north of Iran.
I thought they were. I thought they were actually north along the Caspian. Yeah.
Okay.
I thought so. Yeah, probably Turkey as well. But the point is, we had them surrounded, and Pahlavi was only too glad to play ball with us. And thanks for the Phantoms, and thanks for the training, and thanks for all the good stuff. As long as we played ball with him, and we're cooperative and kept the oil flowing to the west. But yeah, it's so predictable, and you just can't. It's amazing how well he hung on for as long as he did with a lot of our assistance behind the scenes until finally the late 70s. Enough was enough. We got to get rid of this guy and his whole operatives and the whole minions, and the whole corrupt class has been entrenched for 30 plus years. It's just remarkable. Yeah. What a tragic story. Just amazing.
No, it's a very tragic story, but I agree with you. It's very predictable because we've seen this story in several other countries as well. There's a question about a Boeing plane. I honestly don't know if the Shah got that plane. So there are a couple. I would say quicker questions that I'm going to take, and then I'll go to the longer questions because longer. Okay, there's a point that the CIA was willing to be communist paranoid, leading to 2 further decades of erroneous foreign policy. Absolutely. I mean, you have to realize that in the early 1950s versus the mid 1940s, we had moved in the United States, especially, towards a more red-phobic period. So naturally, with McCarthy and the rise of the Republican Party for the first time in the post-war period, we begin to see a very different sort of situation the CIA finds itself in. And the CIA, despite all the talk about the deep state now, is an entity that exists at the will and at the direction of political figures. And so if the political feeling is anti-communist, that's where the money is going to go within the agency, and that's what people are going to look at. So that's certainly going to be part of the situation. There's a comment here that the Atlantic recently ran an interesting article regarding what an American woman's experience were in Turkey as it's retrenching. I haven't seen that particular article, but it doesn't surprise me. Turkey hasn't expelled or otherwise removed Americans, and so we can have these sort of situations. And of course, while there are limitations on freedom of speech inside of Turkey for Turks, Turkey is one of the countries with the highest number of arrested journalists per year in the last few years. Those restrictions don't necessarily extend to non-Turkish citizens, especially those from what are supposedly allied countries. So the presence of that story doesn't surprise me, and also the retrenchment of Islamist policy in Turkey doesn't surprise me either, considering that the Cumhuriyet Halk Partisi, the CHP, doesn't seem to be at all capable of bringing together a coalition of people to oppose the Islamists. There's a comment that the Shah was a great customer for US and UK weapons manufacturers. Absolutely. There's a question about whether the lower right-hand picture where I was talking about pro-Khomeini protesters was from the Ben Affleck movie. I understand that guy definitely does look like Ben Affleck himself, who's holding the poster of Khomeini up. But no, that is actually a legitimate picture from the 10th of December, 1978, of a pro-Khomeini protest at what is today called the Azadi Tower. There's a question of what will be some of the future topics in Middle East and North Africa, and that's a really great question. Next week, as I said, is going to be the Islamic Revolution and the creation of the Islamic Republic. So the last, let's say, 40 years or so, 43 years of Iranian history, which is incredibly complicated. Then we're going to have 2 or 3 presentations on Iraq, which is going to require us to remember all of the Iran stuff that we learned, all of the Levant stuff that we learned, and sort of see where that comes into large-scale fighting. We're going to have a few episodes on Turkey. And after that, I might have an episode or two on Afghanistan and an episode or two on the Arabia and the Persian Gulf. And that would be the end of the series. So that would put us probably in about mid-August. And that's sort of the trajectory I'm on. Maybe there might also be an episode on the Caucasus in the post-Soviet period. Then, so now I have the 2 sort of longer questions. No, Rob, I'm not going to start over from the beginning. This has been a project of 150 hours. So if you want to see it, it's all on YouTube. You can watch it at your own leisure. So now, the first sort of longer question, what in your experience do you think has caused humans, has it been mostly men, do you think, that follow existential philosophies such that religions are that often preach love and understanding to want to take actual lives of their own or other people that believe in other existential philosophies other than themselves seems and remains so absurd to me. Sometimes I feel that lies beneath everything except greed for money and greed for power, perhaps. Would love to know your thoughts. I'm not sure what makes a religion an existential philosophy. But if we're talking about religions preaching love and understanding, that's not what most religions preach. Now, we can talk about the specific precepts of any given faith, but at a fundamental core, religions teach a moral construct that a person needs to follow in some shape or form. And that moral construct comes from a divinity or quasi-divinity, or a set of moral agents who have discovered this knowledge through epiphany. And those who don't follow the particular edicts, these moral edicts, are outside of the community. And if they're outside of the community, they're usually subject to worse treatment, than those inside the group. Now, there comes the question of, to what extent should we impose these moral precepts? To what extent is it important for us, right? Because there's sort of a continuum of, these moral precepts are good for those of us who willingly sign up, but we're willing, even within our own community, to ignore them to a certain degree. And certainly with non-members, we're willing to ignore them. And then, of course, you have on the other side, everybody needs to be like me. And everybody needs to follow and do what I do. And it's very hard from a legitimation standpoint to stand somewhere between those two. Because it's very easy for somebody on the extreme to say, why are you not enforcing this? This should be enforced. Or why are you enforcing this at all? This should never be enforced. But if you're somewhere in the middle, which a lot of people are, then you have that clash. And I would also further argue that religious identity is one form of arranging people. There are other ways of arranging people. You can arrange them by ethnicity. You can arrange them by gender. You can arrange them by economic class. You can arrange them any multitude of ways. And for certain individuals, because of how their interests sit, the moral precepts of the religion don't work as well as one of these other orientations in order to achieve what works best for them. Like, for example, for the Shah, it made sense to be Persian nationalist because it led to larger degrees of centralization, larger degrees of a clear opposition to the power of the mujtahids, a clear legitimacy for the institutions that he had created that supposedly represent the will of the Persian people. And so all of these things fit together. If an existential philosophy in religion's answer to why we are alive and what happens after we die, if religions only answered that question, then there would be no political dimension to religion at all. But that's not the only thing religions answer. And so Therefore, it's sort of a null point. Then another point here is, it's my understanding that for a lot of men who were not pro-Shah, there was nothing to do. They could safely hang around the mosques, and this gave the religious the power they had. Yes, I would say that one of the things I didn't cover as much in this episode as I did in some of the earlier episodes on Persian constitutionalism. One of the historic dimensions of Iranian mosques is the concept of best, or sanctuary, that if a person goes into a mosque, they are able to not be subject to policing, similar to running to a foreign embassy, because of the heightened role of religion. Now, of course, this breaks down during the reign of the Shah to a certain degree, but still the mosques were a safer place for people to meet than other locations. Then sorry, 1 second. So the next comment was, there are not many countries in the world with valuable resources like oil that have not gone through this same transition, except the Shah was actually a nationalist and did the best he could. Within 30 years, he took a backward country with 16th century populace and brought them into the 20th century. No good deed ever goes unpunished. Google women in the 1930s and the 1970s in Iran and look at the difference. Late 1970s, 60% of students in university were women. I mean, I think that that's certainly a position that you can take on the Shah. And I think that those who really benefited from his governance absolutely take that position. More wealth came into the country than ever before. The country was more industrialized than ever before. The country was more urbanized than ever before. Women had more rights. Religious minorities had more rights. The country was far better organized, had a far better train network and delivery network. But if we're talking about how the country was run as a very autocratic system. And so we need to take that into account when we talk about what the Shah was. The next comment I have here is, this sounds like the Russian Revolution. The Bolsheviks prevailed because literally it meant the majority party. No one remembers that Tsar advocated in favor of temporary, much more democratic party. I think the parallels between the Russian Revolution and the Islamic Revolution are going to be much more clear next week. But I would say that there is the similarity in that the Kerensky caretaker government and the Bazargan government were governments that ultimately gave way to the more extreme governments because they weren't as extreme as the extremists were willing to be. Now, the Bolshevik party was called the majority party, but that's what they called themselves. Mensheviks were actually far more numerous. The Bolsheviks just happened to win several choice engagements. So I struggle to see beyond the fact that a group of people who have diverse interests oppose something and it leads to that authoritarian ruler, that monarchical authoritarian ruler leaving. I don't really see a similarity. I think also the Russian Civil War in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution is very different than what happens in Iran, where there is no fight from the left. The left basically concedes over the course of a year, politically speaking. And when the Iran-Iraq war breaks out, it creates nationalism behind the new government. So it's a very different process. There's a comment that so much death and destruction, all in the name of religion. But to ask if the past were different, would that be better? The very question is a precursor to the next end, I think. Yeah. What I think that at a fundamental level, what should have happened that would have been different is if Mossadegh hadn't alienated Kashani and hadn't tried to secularize the country as much as he did in 1952. If that were the case and Kashani was still on his side, then Operation Ajax probably wouldn't have gotten the go-ahead because there wouldn't have been enough Iranians that would have made it look plausible for it to be successful. And so Mossadegh probably would have achieved oil nationalization. The industry would have suffered. And the Americans would probably have had to tell the Brits to give up on their empire. They certainly would have done it after 1956. And so you could have had that earlier style of parliamentary democracy endure. And that would have been a much better outcome for Iran. I don't know to what extent that was actually possible, whether Mossadegh was actually thinking of that possibility, but that would have been a lot less death and destruction on internally in Iran. Next one, Ahmadinejad is a famous Holocaust denier and a revolutionary. I'm trying to remember if he was actively involved in the Islamic Revolution. I don't know if he was, but he certainly is a Holocaust denier, and he certainly believes in the ideals of the revolution. So there's a question, how do you see the current Islamic Republic struggle to return Islamic values to the roles of women and the desire for more options for women emancipated by the Shah under his twin sister's influence? I think that the Islamic Republic by and large gave up on trying to return women to women's roles. Women in Iran are parliamentarians, they drive, they have the societal roles of men, and to the extent that you can say that people have the right to vote in the Islamic Republic, women have the same right as men do. I just question the nature of that vote because 50% of candidates are rejected by the Guardian Council. So 50% of people who want to run never get the chance to run. So the vote doesn't really reflect what people would personally feel necessarily. But the bigger issue goes back to the Kashf Hijab, the forcible deveiling of Reza Khan. And the Islamic Republic reinstated the veil as a requirement because of sort of the reaction to the Kashf Hijab. No, now you can't take it off. Before you were saying you couldn't have it on. Now you can't take it off. And that will create a morality, a modesty that didn't exist during the Shah's time. That's the thought process. I'm not sure whether I buy it. I don't think the majority of young Iranians buy it. There's a question, what do you think of the concept of the one-day wife, the muta, to have a man being with a woman okay in Iran? I'm not going to opine on the morality of it. I think that discerning listeners can figure out the moral position here. But what I will do is I'll describe the practice. So historically within Shiite Islam, there is the possibility of what's called muta, which is the ability for a person to have a timed marriage. The marriage will expire on a certain date. And so unlike Sunni Islam, where what is required is talaq, or an actual act of divorce. For most Shiite marriages, you would also need talaq. But if you engage in a muta as your type of marriage, you don't need to actually engage in divorce. The divorce happens as an act of the marriage contract. And so what happens in Iran today is that you'll have women who will marry men for 1 day or 2 days. And because prostitution is illegal in Iran, but sex during a marriage is not illegal, and also there's no such thing as domestic rape in Iran, meaning that a husband and wife cannot rape each other by law, despite whether or not she or he consents to the sex. This has basically been sort of a backdoor within Iran, which operates according to the Shiite understanding of the Sharia, for prostitution to occur, because a man will simply marry a woman for a day sleep with her, and then go on and live his life. There's a question of what program did I use to make the presentation? It's just PowerPoint. That's it. I just have a knack of making things look nice. All right, so I think that seems to cover all of the questions. Is there anything else before we head out?
Great job.
Question, I'm guessing the woman ends up as trash afterwards. Trash is a strong word, but I would say unmarriageable in the traditional non-muta sense.
Richard, correct me if I'm wrong. Most of the, and again, don't call me on it. I just saw a documentary, but most of the women that do it is mostly divorced or is already had been in marriage prior to that, and so that's why it's okay, I guess, in that sense. And the man won't just be with them unless they have that marriage certificate.
Right. No, look, prostitution is illegal in Iran. Iran has a very powerful religious police organization that will arrest people, especially women, who have sex outside of marriage. So the
there's money involved with it.
The muta protects the woman in that situation. But we should be very clear about why these women are engaging in these kinds of relationships. These are not entrepreneurial women who are thinking, this is a really great way for me to make some money, right? Like you might say about an American cam girl, depending on the situation. These are women who don't have other career opportunities, who don't have the ability to make money otherwise. And so they're engaging in what is effectively low-end prostitution under the legal protection of a timed marriage.
Yeah, that's what I meant. I mean, there has to be money involved for this to work.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
There's a comment, I was once told by a woman that I'm no good for marriage or any man now that I'm not a virgin. That is certainly a perception in the more traditional parts of Iran. I would argue, though, with the high level of urbanization that Iran now has, I don't know if you remember from that graph, Iran is about 80 to 90% urbanized at this point. Most people in Iran actually have a more developed, in the Western sense, human rights-centric morality than the government of Iran does at this point. So again, we have to go back to that set of different parties that are involved in the negotiation over Iran's future. And the ulama are not supported by the landowners or by the bazaar guilds, and they're certainly not supported by those with foreign influence. And those people have a different view on these sorts of topics than might the Islamic Republic's government. Yeah, and of course, the view of virginity being magically special is almost cross-cultural.
Lordy.
Yeah. So, Patty, any other comments before I close this out?
Sorry, I forgot I forgot I was unmuted. I just was like trying to get my arms and head around that whole thing. It's like feeling lucky I don't live there.
Yeah. All right. So I think I'm going to close this out then if there's nothing further to say. Thank you, everybody who joined. And I'll see everybody next week, hopefully.
Thank you, Richard. Thank
Yeah,
you.
you did a great job with what could have been complicated. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, I mean, this is the thing with the stuff from the 1500s, we have some details, and so it's much easier to put together a presentation because, you know, we have 5 facts, you can draw a line. When it comes to this modern stuff, it's a lot more complex.
Yeah, you did a good job with it, though.
Thank you. All right. Good night, everybody.
Have a wonderful week, everybody. See you soon.
Have a wonderful weekend. All right, I'll see everybody next week.
Bye.
Bye.